The officer turned to me. I'll make sure this gets handled properly. You'll need to file a report with us, but this woman will not be bothering you anymore. As I stood there watching the police car drive away, I realized that this wasn't just about the spike strips. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the person causing the trouble had power and authority on her side. The rest of the neighborhood quickly learned what had happened, and many of them came over to thank me. Mrs. Sutherland had been a source of stress and fear for so many people, and now she was no longer in charge of anything. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, I received a formal apology from the HOA office, and I learned that Mrs. Sutherland had been removed from her position as president. The neighborhood, once ruled by her tyrannical grip, started to feel more like a community again. People began talking to each other, helping each other out, and most importantly, they felt safe in their own homes once more. It was an unexpected victory, and as I stood in front of my house, looking at the driveway where the spike strips had once been, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. It had always been a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew everyone's name, waved politely as they passed by, and, for the most part, stayed out of each other's business. That was until Mrs. Sutherland, the HOA Karen, as she was affectionately, but not kindly known, moved in. To say she didn't blend well into the community was an understatement. She wasn't just the president of the Homeowners Association. She acted as though she had the final say on absolutely everything. If you didn't trim your hedges exactly to her liking, you'd get a letter. If your lawn wasn't the right shade of green, she'd knock on your door. Over time, it seemed like she had a personal vendetta against anyone who didn't conform to her idea of proper suburban living. As much as I'd tried to avoid confrontation with her, I knew deep down that sooner or later, we'd clash. It all started one fateful Saturday morning when I woke up to an eerie quietness. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, birds chirping, kids playing, were absent. Instead, I heard faint rustling from outside, and when I looked through my window, I saw Mrs. Sutherland crouched near the edge of my driveway, holding something that looked suspiciously like a spike strip. Confused, I squinted. No way, I muttered to myself. She was actually installing spike strips. At first, I thought maybe I had mistaken what I was seeing, but then it became clear. She was placing those orange metal strips on the ground directly where I usually park my car. I was beyond furious. My driveway was private property, and this woman, who already had a reputation for overstepping her boundaries, had now crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. Not only was she trying to damage my property, but she was also putting my safety at risk. I rushed outside. "Mrs. Sutherland!" I called, my voice rising. She froze, her eyes darting over to me as if she hadn't expected anyone to confront her. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Oh, it's nothing. Just making sure your car doesn't block my view," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You know, the HOA guidelines. They don't allow for any obstructions near driveways." I was stunned. "Are you serious? You're putting spike strips on my property?" She simply nodded, like this was some sort of perfectly normal and acceptable behavior. "Yes, well, I'm just doing what's best for the neighborhood." I was livid, but I tried to stay calm. "You can't just go around putting things on people's driveways, Mrs. Sutherland. That's illegal." "Oh, you can call the police, but I'm sure they'll agree with me," she replied dismissively, clearly used to getting away with whatever she wanted. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was absurd. She had completely lost her mind. I stepped forward and grabbed my phone, dialing the police as I did. "I need to report vandalism. A neighbor is putting dangerous objects on my property." By the time the officer arrived, Mrs. Sutherland had retreated to her front porch, watching me with a smug expression, like she had already won. But I wasn't backing down. I explained the situation to the officer, telling him about the spike strips and how she was violating both my property rights and, in my opinion, common sense. The officer was visibly confused, so I led him to the driveway, showing him the strips. "This is serious," the officer said, shaking his head. "She's not just trespassing. She's tampering with your property and putting everyone at risk. I'm going to need her to come down here." As the officer walked toward Mrs. Sutherland's house, she came out, her arms crossed defiantly. "What's the issue now?" she demanded, clearly irritated. The officer told her to step aside, which she did with a huff, muttering something about how People these days don't understand the rules. She tried to justify her actions again, saying it was all for the greater good of the community and that she was just trying to enforce HOA rules. But the officer wasn't having it. You've gone too far. What you're doing is not just violating HOA guidelines, it's actually endangering people's lives. I'm placing you under arrest for criminal trespassing and vandalism. I watched, wide-eyed, as the officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them around her wrists. Her face turned beet red, and she tried to argue her way out of it, but it was no use. It was clear that the law wasn't on her side. "Wait!" she yelled, suddenly desperate. "You can't do this! I'm the HOA president. I have rights." The officer remained calm. "You may be the president of the HOA, but you're not above the law." As Mrs. Sutherland was escorted into the police car, I felt a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. She had terrorized the neighborhood for years with her petty demands and domineering attitude. Now she was paying the price.